22. October 1965, Düsseldorf. I once counted bombs. Now I count refrigerators. Prophet does not distinguish between peace and war. He wrote it in a black notebook with a blue ribbon, in a hand neat from drafting rooms and requisition forms. He wrote it without thinking about who might read it. He wrote it late at night after the newspapers described testimony in Frankfurt, and a photograph of a production line at his factory ran beneath a headline about growth. It was a dangerous sentence, if you believed that democracy rested on tidy stories and useful silences. It was an honest sentence, if you had spent 20 years transmuting steel and silence into prosperity. It was his thesis about the way lives carry systems forward, unbroken by defeat, reconfigured by necessity. 15. April 1945, Düsseldorf. Rain and smoke. An occupation report from the British Second Army described a city reduced to an obstacle course of walls and pits. Photographs in the Bundesarchiv show cathedral spires rising above roofs like teeth in a jaw blasted away. The bridges over the Rhine were twisted and down. The chimneys of the armaments works stood. The machines beneath them were gone or hidden, dismantled by orders from Berlin that arrived too late or too early. Karl was 33. He had studied mechanical engineering in Aachen before the war, and was hired by a metalworks on the northern edge of Düsseldorf that turned out artillery components and later aircraft engine parts. He was not a soldier. He was a manager of flow and quota, a clerk of material, a tender of numbers that became weapons. We measured output in casings, not in bodies, he would write in retirement. But the arithmetic connected. At the plant, he had a badge that gave him access to the heavy stores. It allowed him to move during curfew if the sirens were not sounding. It put him in the small class of men in wartime who were not at the front because the front depended on them. The armaments, mathematics had been simple and brutal. Inputs, steel, copper, rubber, coal, electricity and labor, including forced labor whose names were recorded in foreign scripts on work tags he initialed, without learning how to pronounce them. Outputs, shells, engine parts, profit, survival. He did the sums in pencil. He believed numbers shielded him. They did not. 18. April 1945. British forces entered. Curfew posted, 2100 to 0600. Surrendered weapons to be deposited at collection points. Food stocks to be handed over, counted, redistributed. The municipal administration was to be purged of Nazis, then restarted. There would be ration cards for all. There would be rumors of reprisals and rumors of mercy. The machines of control changed uniforms and language. The ledgers remained. A clerk in the city's housing office wrote in her diary, "They put up signs in English, and we pretend to understand. They put up signs in German, and we pretend to obey. We have no beds. They ask us for lists." An Allied intelligence summary from the British zone recorded anxiety at the prospect of Russians coming and relief that the fighting here is done, mixed with fear of the unknown judicial process. The rubble was lifted by women. They were photographed and named Trümmerfrauen by magazines that needed symbols. In their kitted coats and headscarves, wielding handcarts and shovels, they became emblems that allowed men to believe the city was being remade by innocence, by the feminine resilience of the nation. An oral history recorded in 1971 captures a different tone. "We dug because there was nothing else," a former telephone operator said. "We made piles of brick because nobody had asked us to count dead. The bricks were all that answered back. The mathematics of brick and ash. 1 block cleared, 2 rooms found, a staircase made possible. To speak of numbers was safer than to speak of names. The first weeks after capitulation were marked by compiling. There were lists of the living, lists of the missing, lists of Nazis, lists of ex-Nazis, lists of stolen property, lists of requisitioned rooms, lists of children who needed milk, lists of children who were now legally fatherless, though their fathers were not all dead. Ration cards were printed by the mayor's office. The British major assigned to supervise municipal supply wrote in his occupation report, "The situation can be stabilized. However, the population must be encouraged through steady work and adequate nutrition." In the margin, in pencil, an unknown hand added, "Neither is insufficient supply." The mathematics of food was severe. In the summer of 1945, an adult in the British zone might have 1,200 to 1,000 calories a day on paper, less in practice. Heavy labourers were entitled to more. Those with connections and cigarettes were entitled to everything. A kilo of butter had a black market price measured in lucky strikes. A piece of ham could require a bicycle and a journey into the countryside, what everyone called a hamster fart, a hamster run, burrowing for potatoes, sugar beets, anything. Cigarettes became a unit of account, a currency that smelled like power. One British occupation report observed, "An effective economic calculus has emerged in which tobacco substitutes for marks. A pack of 20 can obtain 1 kg of flour in town, 2 kg in rural regions." The arithmetic of hunger was relentless and humiliating. You knew your daily ration. You knew your waistline and the hollow beneath your breastbone. You knew if the butcher had kept something aside for a woman he preferred. You knew nothing about tomorrow. Carl learned to bargain in a new register. He had been good at extracting quotas from foremen with threats from above. He now extracted potatoes with jokes and cigarettes and the exchange of bolts. He kept his badge and his pencil. He learned the English words for manager and non-political. He learned to produce papers. In June 1945, notices appeared. All adults must fill out questionnaires. The Fragebogen was a thick form, more book than form, with 131 questions in some versions. It asked for dates, memberships, donations, places where one worked, names of superiors, names of subordinates. It asked for the past to be submitted in the proper bureaucratic format. Denazification would be done by sheets and committees. The Sprechkammern, the chambers of judgment, which would sort people into categories. Hauptschuldig, major offenders. Belastet, offenders. Minderbelastet, lesser offenders. Mitläufer, followers. Entlastet, exonerated. There would be sanctions attached to each classification. Prison, fines, restrictions on employment. There would be the right to appeal. There would be neighbours ready to provide either affidavits of exoneration, the so-called Perselschein, the whitewashing papers named after a detergent, or affidavits of guilt. Karl filled his Fragebogen with a ruler beneath the lines. He dated his party membership to 1937 rather than 1933. He listed the organizations he could not avoid listing and omitted meetings he believed could not be traced. He wrote that he had accepted positions at the factory to keep his job. He wrote that he had intervened on behalf of a French worker sent to the sickbay. He had, one time after a fever. He did not write about the afternoon he signed off on a request for a new barbed wire allocation for the barracks at the edge of the plant. He brought 2 Perselschein to his hearing. One from a priest, this man donated to the parish's relief for evacuees. One from a master mechanic with a scar from the Somme. He helped me get my son out of the Hitler Youth when the boy was sick. The Sprechkammer clerk noted these. The hearing lasted 31 minutes. The Sprechkammer process was both earnest and political. There were men and women appointed to judge who believed they were building a different Germany. There were also files stacked 2 feet high and budgets running out. Occupation rule demanded both accountability and production. The British and Americans needed a functioning Germany more than they needed a thoroughly cleansed one. The mathematics of denazification was an equation with stability on one side and justice on the other, weighted by the Cold War's approach like a hand on a scale. An Allied intelligence summary in 1947 summarized the situation in the British zone succinctly. Surprisingly few fall into the higher categories. The mass are classified as followers. The practical imperative of rebuilding ensures a certain leniency, particularly in technical fields. Bundesarchiv records from North Rhine-Westphalia show a bell curve, spikes at Mittelhofer and Entlerstedt, a tale of offenders. Some were imprisoned. Others paid fines, lost their pensions, and went back to work under new titles. The mathematics of guilt settled into a stable pattern. Those who had shouted continued to speak softly into telephones. Those who had survived learned a language of apologies without subjects and verbs. Mistakes were made. We were misled. The times were like that. December 1945. A train arrived in Bonn loaded with people and bundles. They were labeled refugees and expellees, words that stapled their biographies to geopolitics. The city had already been assigned people to whom it owed obligations, its own homeless, its own widows and orphans, its own returning soldiers. But the new arrivals were German, now made foreign in their own tongue. They spoke with accents from Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland. They had been ordered onto roads and wagons by new governments in Poland and Czechoslovakia, many brutalized along the way. Many who had themselves benefited from earlier brutalities. They carried photographs and featherbeds. They carried fleas. They carried grudges that were both entirely justified and entirely unwelcome everywhere they went. Düsseldorf registered 90,000 expellees by 1947. Town halls posted notices, rooms to be requisitioned. The housing office sent men with clipboards and tape measures into apartments that still had glass. A married couple with one child could be assigned a second family of 4 into their 2-room flat. The arithmetic of space became precise and intimate. A room measured 12 square meters. 2 families' needs measured a negotiation of doors and mealtimes. A woman from Breslau wrote in a letter preserved in an oral history archive, "We live now behind a curtain, in a corner of a stranger's life." A policeman in Düsseldorf recorded in his report book, "Arguments over stoves, arguments over potatoes, arguments over noise." Often the original tenant blames the incoming expellees. In some cases, the reverse. In all cases, too many people. The arithmetic of work mirrored the arithmetic of shelter. The city needed labor to clear rubble and to rebuild. The expellees were expected to be grateful for any work and resented for taking it. They were at once Germans, recipients of solidarity in the abstract, and foreigners in practice. Associations formed with names that placed the past at the center of the present. Landsmannschaft Schlesien, Landsmannschaft Schlesien, Landsmannschaft der Sudetendeutschen. Heimat became a word sharpened by the impossibility of return. The state would later offer the Lastenausgleich, a tax on property to compensate for lost property in the East, a transfer of money that converted one kind of loss into another. On ledger lines, the mathematics seemed balanced. Those who had something paid, those who had nothing received. In kitchens, the conversations were less tidy. Between the expellees and the townspeople were other, less visible communities living near German cities in 1945 and 1946. Displaced persons, DPs. The letters covered Jews who had survived camps and forests. They covered Poles who did not wish to return to a homeland, now under a different new regime. They covered Ostarbeiter from the Soviet Union, who waited in camps to be repatriated, sometimes fearing what awaited them there. UNRA then, The International Refugee Organization managed DP camps in requisitioned barracks, schools, hotels. There were Yiddish newspapers and courts. There were Polish theaters. There were people waiting to leave Germany while living within it. There were fences that demarcated zones in which German law and habit did not quite apply. On a Sunday in July 1946, Karl bicycled past such a camp on the road toward Rattingen. On the fence hung a banner in a language he could not read and a Star of David. Children were playing with a ball. A British sergeant with his sleeves rolled up talked to a woman with grey hair whose arms had numbers. Karl looked away. He had seen newsreel images in May 1945 projected in the damp hall of the factory that was now a storehouse. Corpses like bark peeled from trees. A pile of shoes. The films had been forced on Germans as instruction. The faces of the dead looked into the camera like a question. In an OM-GUS survey from the American zone, a report read, "Germans acknowledge crimes in general, but often minimize specific knowledge or responsibility, some resentment at the manner of presentation." In the British zone, public opinion reports noted a similar pattern: rejection of National Socialism as failure and catastrophe, acceptance of bombing as the central trauma, retreat into narratives of being misled or forced. The mathematics of contact with victims was uneasy. "I did not know," was an answer that asked to be not known in return. There were exceptions, and there were moments. A municipal engineer in Düsseldorf recorded an inspection of a requisitioned building near the Hauptbahnhof in late 1946. The top floor houses a Jewish relief committee. They have installed a soup kitchen run on donations. They asked me to sign a paper for more coal. I said I would see what could be done. The woman behind the table had the manner of someone who has seen everything. I signed. Small acts of solidarity occurred, often private, often eroded by the flood of practicalities into which they were thrown. The winter of 1946-47 was named for the turnip. It was the hunger winter. It was extremely cold. Rivers froze. Coal trains did not arrive. Pipes cracked. The ration schedules printed by the occupation authorities became decorative. They were outstripped by thermodynamics and theft. Hospitals treated frostbite in cities. People burned furniture. They burned any papers that did not prove something or feed something. Trümmerfrauen worked with numb hands. Children's bellies swelled and deflated. Allied administrators wrote in tight prose about tonnages and priorities. Coal is the bottleneck. Without coal, food rots, factories stop, morale collapses. We must secure coal and transport coal. The mathematics of winter refused sentiment. And yet survivors also married and conceived children. They celebrated weddings with ersatz coffee and cake baked with roots. They baptized children with rationed candles. The arithmetic of life had its own momentum. Birth rates rose again. In a DP camp a few miles from Düsseldorf, a Jewish wedding was held in 1947. Photographs show brides in American dresses sewn from parachute silk, grooms holding up the corners of a cloth with stars. The moral geometry of adjacency. Those who suffered terribly and those who had participated, passively or actively, now living next to each other, was too complex for any ledger. On 20 June 1948, money changed. At midnight, a currency reform enacted. The Reichsmark died. The Deutsche Mark was born. The accounting of post-war scarcity reset. In apartments across the British and American zones, old notes were wrapped, exchanged, counted, capped. The next day, shop windows that had been empty or staged filled with goods. Stock that had been hidden reappeared. The initial conversion of 40 DM per person put purchasing power back in pockets, then habits attacked the new prices. The free market magician was Ludwig Erhard. The phrase was not new, but it now anchored a policy, soziale Marktwirtschaft, a social market economy. The ERP, the European Recovery Programme, shipped crates marked with stars and the letters ERP to docks at Bremen and to rail yards near the Ruhr. Machines, steel, grain, fuel, lubricant, pharmaceutical supplies, spare parts all arrived with documentation and conditions. The mathematics of the Marshall Plan was as carefully worked out as any German spreadsheet. Each ounce of copper wire drawn for a motor winding, each bag of Canadian wheat, was tied to counterpart funds, to targets, to a story sold to American taxpayers about future stability and future markets. Brits and Americans visited factories with clipboards. They wrote in their occupation reports, "The plant shows promise. Management is technically competent. Political reliability. Satisfactory. Labor relations require monitoring." The armaments factory where Karl had worked was decartelized, then rebuilt into a machinery works that made refrigeration units for industrial kitchens, then household appliances, as orders from restaurants and cafes were outpaced by orders from new families. Heavy-duty presses that had stamped gun barrels, stamped compressor housings. The milling machines shaved aluminum fan blades. The floor smelled of oil and fresh paint. The men who called themselves masters managed lines of young workers born in the 1920s and the late 1930s who had learned to survive on ingenious thrift and then learned to read blueprints. Karl was hired because he knew the old machines and the new numbers. He was also hired because the Spruchkammer had classified him as Mitläufer, and the need for competent men overshadowed the desire for exemplary penance. He ran procurement. He counted copper, steel, rubber, compressors, wages, and the expected arrival of a railcar from Bremen with ERP-funded gauges. He counted time wasted when repairs were delayed. He counted cigarettes traded on break. He wrote in reports to the British and to the new management boards, production target met at 92%. Delays due to shortage of precision bearings. Quality acceptable for contract type B. The mathematics had once been ordnance, it was now household. But the structure input, output, fault, reward remained. Denazification files of men like Karl were closed one by one and stacked. Amnesty provisions broadened. There was a law, later, that allowed those who had been dismissed from civil service for political reasons after the war to return, the so-called Unundegadet Gesetz. There were men who had worn uniforms with skulls who slicked into different uniforms with knots at the shoulders. There were judges who had written death sentences under the Third Reich who wrote legal opinions under the Federal Republic. The arithmetic of expertise is unromantic. It favors continuity masquerading as reform. A British official wrote in a private letter preserved in a Midlands University archive, "We are building with what we have, not with what we wish we had." The Cold War put its thumb more heavily on the scales. In 1948, Berlin was blockaded by the Soviets. Airplanes flew in coal. Chocolate bars were tied to parachutes for children. Germany's status shifted from beaten enemy to ally being made carefully. The mathematics of loyalty had to be computed differently. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. The Bundeswehr was formed. Many of those who had commanded or supplied in the old Wehrmacht now served anew. In Karl's factory, an old colleague who had once supervised the lathe section returned from POW camp and was hired as an inspector. "We know him. He knows the machines." The political officer from 1944 had become a quality assurance manager in 1956. "I have always been exacting," he said in a company interview kept in a basement file. Between 1949 and 1953, the Wirtschaftswunder began to be felt from wallets outward. It was initially a quiet wonder. It felt like boots that fit and a coat that was not a uniform. It felt like butter on bread without guilt. It felt like a tram that ran and a cinema that showed movies about happy people in mountain valleys. It felt like silence. It also felt like work. The hours were long. The air in factories was dirty. The unions and the employers made bargains, wage increases against productivity increases, co-determination with a law-backed structure, strikes rare and contained. The mathematics of the miracle was not magical. It was measured, steel output per hour, units shipped per month, wages tied to price indices, adjusted for ERPs and tax policy, pensions indexed later. In 1952, the Lassenausgleich was enacted, a compensation fund for those who had lost everything to the East. Owners of property in the West paid a levy over many years. The idea was that the nation's physical losses were to be socialized. It was an attempt at justice by numbers. Some checks alleviated poverty, some funded hates. At Karl's kitchen table, his wife wrote in their budget ledger, "Lastenausgleich payment due. We will not buy coats this year." A colleague from Silesia, who assembled compressor housings, used his payment to put a down payment on a small house financed by a bank that specialized in rebuilding. At lunch, he told jokes about Pomeranian fishermen and cried into his soup on the anniversary of his father's disappearance during the trek. School books arrived in the homes of children born during or after the war. They told the story of a Germany seduced and then punished. They placed bombed cities at the center of the narrative. They placed expulsion photographs next to maps. The pages had black and white pictures of rubble and masons. The Jewish victims were included in a manner that was both true and thin. A chapter, then a test, then a page turned. Teachers in their 50s taught material they had avoided in their 30s. Public commemorations sprouted in squares, plaques that memorialized victims of war and tyranny. Wreaths at monuments inscribed with the names of towns and dates of battles, not the names of neighbors who had vanished in 1942. A brown brick wall near the rail yard carried an informal chalk inscription someone wrote in 1945, "Belsen. Do not forget." By 1948, it had been washed off and repainted, then used to advertise washing machines. There were exceptions here too. In some churches, names read aloud included those deported for being Jewish, and for being communists, and for being homosexual, and for being Roma. In some schoolrooms, teachers asked students to ask their parents questions and not accept silence. In most, silence was the habit of the time. An Allied public opinion report from 1951 in the British zone summarized, "Knowledge of atrocities is widespread, willingness to discuss is limited, greater concern with present economic circumstances." At work, Karl hired with a view to speed. Former soldiers with missing fingers proved good at small adjustments. Expellees were eager. Women were hired as operators, then expected to resign upon marriage. The mathematics of gender was returned to its pre-war settings, except where economic necessity kept it from sliding completely back. "We need their hands," a foreman said in a report that a personnel officer filed and then betrayed to an oral historian 40 years later. "But we do not need their opinions." Trümmerfrauen disappeared back into kitchens. The novels of the time placed moral pain into forms the market could sell. And yet, there were moments when history punctured schedules. In 1950, a man with a limp and a piece of paper arrived at the gate. He asked for a certificate that he had worked at the plant during the war to satisfy a question asked at a Soviet transit camp. The clerk looked at the personnel records and found the entry in a stern hand. "Temporary worker, 1943-44, Polish." The man had a different name now. He said it with wonder, the way a person touches an old scar. The clerk wrote a new letter and stamped it with a stamp that would have been illegal 10 years earlier. We were learning new rules. We were attached to old forms. The Korean War began, and prices spiked. The rush for metals revived heavy industry. Orders rose at the refrigerator factory. The arithmetic of profits became public. We must expand, a board member said in minutes typed by a secretary who had typed orders during different men speaking. Karl was promoted, then promoted again. He was instructed to travel to Turin to purchase machine tools and to Boston to negotiate a license for a new refrigerant. His English improved, his sleep did not. In hotel rooms he read technical journals and the Frankfurter Allgemeine. He folded the newspaper to avoid the photographs when there were photographs. He wrote in his notebook about the arithmetic of lines per hour, about the precise heat transfer characteristics of new alloys, about the advantage of a lighter compressor in reducing overall unit weight. That same notebook also carried notes about the cost of labor, about a trade union representative's demand, about a small pay raise pegged to productivity, 4% in exchange for a new shift schedule. The mathematics of the social market was honest, flexible. It produced stability. It also produced a gentle anesthesia. This was the heart of the unspoken bargain he would later try to describe. Democracy in exchange for silence, prosperity in exchange for forgetting the parts of numbers that did not fit on the page. Political parties reinvented themselves. The Christian Democrats wore respectable greys and ate soup in photographs near rubble. The Social Democrats wore respectable greys and ate soup too. They disagreed in public in ways that fit and strengthened a new public. They understood the Cold War as both threat and opportunity. The Soviets and their German allies in the East built their own monuments and their own stories, casting the past as capitalist fascism and the present as the end of fascism through the party. In the West, the past was cast as a warning that required guardedness and new alliances. The mathematics of this political system placed its greatest stress on continuity, disguised as renewal. Karl's denazification file shows that he donated to all major parties in small amounts between 1951 and 1956. The file notes contacts with British industry advisors, and a note that reads, "Reliable, works hard, not political." His personnel file, saved inadvertently and later deposited in a local archive, shows that in 1957 he initiated a hiring initiative for expellees, in part because he found them diligent, in part because he aligned the program with a state subsidy. He translated moral repair into a line item and a production increase. This is a critique. It is also a description of the only language some institutions spoke. There were cracks. In 1952, a traveling exhibition about the crimes of the camps stopped in a nearby town. Karl went on a weekday, taking a long lunch, thinking he was doing his duty. He stood in front of a photograph of baby Yar and found himself looking at a face in the crowd that resembled a man who had been a buyer at his plant, an office joker who had laughed about everything. He stood there too long. He walked out into the square and bought a sausage and ate it without tasting it and went back to work and told no one. In 1955, the first large group of prisoners of war returned from the Soviet Union. The Heimkehrer walked off trains into church squares. They wore coats that did not fit and hats with odd shapes. Families converged, sometimes to find a husband returned, complication to a second life built in the meantime. At the factory gate, a man named Dieter, who had once trained Karl on a machine, walked in like a ghost learning to materialize. He had not been a party member. He had been an effective supervisor and a bully. He asked for work. He had a letter from the labor office. He got a job in the tool room. The mathematics of decency could not be applied, only the arithmetic of habit. Karl's children grew up with American music and German spelling. They had a father who could buy them a bicycle. They had a mother who could buy herself a coat. Their textbooks told them to be grateful for democracy, and implied this meant not asking questions that would embarrass the facilitator of their comfort. The family photo album filled with images of the factory's summer festival, with men in short sleeves and beer barrels and speeches about productivity that used the word freedom with a precise emptiness. The city rebuilt its main street into something modern, flat, rational. A theatre was opened where a synagogue had once been. The synagogue was rebuilt elsewhere, and quietly. In 1958, sales in refrigerators exploded. Refrigerators became a measure of arrival, of a laborer's wife freed from daily shopping. It was a new normal. A photograph caption in a corporate publication called Zukunft shows Karl shaking hands with a customer in a suit by a wall of white units. The article speaks of innovation, of motor efficiency, of service networks across the Bundesrepublik. There is no mention that compressor housings once echoed barrels. There does not need to be. Everybody knows, and nobody says. In 1962, Der Spiegel was raided by police. A scandal. The state stumbled into a posture of authority that looked like the one the state had performed before 1945. People protested. Adenauer left. A generation that had grown up in rubble found its voice. Their children learned to ask better questions. They learned to use words like continuity and complicity. In December 1963, the first Auschwitz trial opened in Frankfurt. Fritz Bauer, a prosecutor who had fled the Nazis and returned to bring justice into the courts, had forced a case. The newspapers carried names and testimony that cut through the language of the 1950s like glass. Men who had built normal lives, one who worked in a department store, one who ran a small factory, stood accused of the most abnormal crimes, selections, beatings, shootings, the organization of murder. Witnesses spoke. They spoke in Yiddish-filtered German. They spoke in Polish-accented German. They spoke flatly, like accountants of death. The mathematics of guilt became unignorable in its specificity. There were dates and trucks and numbers of deported per night. Karl cut the articles out and put them in a folder. He told himself he should prepare in case his children asked. They did not. Their school dealt with the subject in a class that emphasized the seduction of the masses. His church held a service in which victimhood was the general theme. He paid. He waited. He agreed with everything and felt nothing but a sharp, undirected pain. He wrote in his notebook then, "The war shows itself now as an endless balancing of ledger lines that do not close. I know which columns I filled. I know which columns I ignored." He was not a wicked man. He was not a good man. He was an efficient man who embraced duty without interrogating its content. He believed himself apolitical because he worked with units and targets. His Spruchkammer file contains a sentence he likely repeated to himself many times: "I was merely a follower." In the British occupation reports, one finds a similar sentence many times: "He is a good technician and will be useful." In the union meeting minutes another: "We need secure employment. We will not hunt ghosts." His guilt settled into patterns of behavior, overcompensation for small sins, under-examination of big ones. He hired a Jewish salesman in 1964 and told himself this was brave, and it was, and was, and was not. He insisted that the factory celebrate its 10-year anniversary of the household unit with a donation to a fund for victims' families, and omitted to specify which victims. He voted for the party that promised order. He wrote quietly in a notebook at night like a man siphoning off pressure. He could describe the arithmetic of food from 1946 with perfect clarity. He could describe the arithmetic of copper in 1950 with almost perfect accuracy. He could number the expellees that came through his factory and estimate their productivity with an engineer's confidence. He could not calculate the mathematics of guilt in any formula that balanced. The categories used by the Sprüchkammer had relieved him of the burden of classification by placing him in the safe mass, Mittelwürfe. The categories used by his conscience were less elastic and less neatly named. There were voices in the archive that ran parallel to his and cut a quan.